Welcome to CivilNet. Our guest today is Professor Ronald Grigor Suny. Ronald Grigor Suny is a historian, professor of history and political science at the University of Michigan, emeritus professor of history and political science at the University of Chicago, and author of more than 20 books. Is a specialist on Russian and Soviet history. Professor Suny, welcome to CivilNet, and thank you for your time.
I'm very happy to be here today.
Dr. Suny, we're in Armenia living dramatic times, and many people draw parallels what is happening now and what happened 100 years ago in this region and in its surroundings. 100 years ago, there was the precipitous demise of the Russian Empire, the withdrawal of Russians from this region, the withdrawal of Russians from their western territories after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and now we see sort of similar developments. Again, Russia is involved in this Ukraine war, but unlike the events 100 years ago, it's now attacking the Ukraine. Are we witnessing somehow the new elevation of Russia, or is this just the beginning of a new demise of Russia?
Karen, I like very much the way you place this whole story back in history. History is obviously not irrelevant to Armenians. In fact, in some ways, Armenians are overburdened by history. We have too much history. Sometimes we get the wrong lessons from history. But if you think back exactly 100 years ago, or 101 or 2 years ago, Transcaucasia, the South Caucasus, was caught between two revolutionary regimes, the Bolsheviks in Russia, who were advancing through Azerbaijan and then Georgia into Armenia, and the Kemalist nationalists in Turkey, who were reconsolidating what was left of the Ottoman Empire, that is, what would become the new Turkish Republic. And that was an extraordinarily dangerous time for Armenia. And ultimately, because of the complexities of geography, diplomacy, and military conflict, Armenia had ultimately, for its own salvation, to side with Bolshevik Russia, with what became the Soviet Union, which for the next 70 years became the principal protector of this small republic, the only part of Armenia which survived after the genocide of 1915, the revolution and civil wars in both Russia, the great empire of Russia, and the Ottoman states. So that was an extraordinarily precarious time for Armenians. And yet it was also a moment where Armenia's resurrection and rebuilding began for the next 70 years as part of the Soviet Union. It's a history that many Armenians have now forgotten or rejected. But the 20th century, for all the horrors of Soviet state building, of Stalinism, of the Second World War, of the collapse, it was a period of relative stability and relative prosperity, relative economic, political, and cultural development in that little republic. And now, a century later, with the demise of the Soviet Union and 30 years of Armenian independence, the little Republic of Armenia now faces again almost an existential crisis for its survival. And once again, its dependence on Russia is obvious and almost inevitable. But there's a problem. This Russia is not Soviet Russia. This Russia is not going to be the Soviet Union. This is an independent state with its own national interests. And at the moment, because of the extraordinary blunder, the colossal strategic mistake that Vladimir Putin made by invading his neighbor Ukraine, Armenia has been left extraordinarily vulnerable without the immediate protection of its one guarantor, that is Russia. And obviously, its hostile neighbors, most importantly, Azerbaijan, has taken advantage of this momentary absence of Russia and has in fact launched this conflict and even invasion of the Republic. This is not anything you don't know, but the way you posed the question was so correct and so appropriate to see it as a parallel history to that other moment of state collapse of the nascent states, the adjacent states of Russia and the Ottoman Empire. So that's where we are today, and it's a very fearful and dangerous moment.
This danger is exacerbated by the fact that we have an immensity of this unpredictability and uncertainty. We don't know what would happen in Ukraine. We don't know what would happen in Russia, and we don't know how Armenia can overcome these calamities. And I remember a few years ago when you were here in Armenia, you were delivering a speech saying that I cannot imagine Armenia without Russia. Я не могу представить Армению без России. So how is it any way possible to imagine Armenia now without Russia, given all these geopolitical and tectonic shifts that they're witnessing?
Armenia without Russia, of course, is extraordinarily vulnerable and in a position of great precarity and danger. But, you know, when you have an ally that has shown itself to be so unreliable as Putin's Russia, given the war that happened 2 years ago and Russia basically sitting on the sidelines till the last minute, it shows both the dependence on Russia, as ultimately it was Russia that had to enforce the armistice that existed. So it shows the dependence on Russia as well as the unreliability of Russia. And you're right to pose the question in exactly that way. That is, look at the situation. What kind of ally is this? We need Russia, and at the same time, we can't rely on Russia. And you're right completely, Karin, to talk about the unpredictability of the situation. And by the way, the unpredictability is not only for Armenia, it's for Russia too. Putin doesn't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. Putin is himself in a very precarious position. This call up of 300,000 soldiers or reservists, the fact that hundreds of thousands of young Russians are fleeing the country rather than serve to defend Russia in this ridiculous war that Putin launched, that there are demonstrations. There's actually a kind of insurrection in Dagestan, not that far from Armenia. This is an extraordinary moment. It's not the end of Putin, because the oligarchs, the military, the establishment in Russia needs Putin. He's the keystone. He's the person that holds that crumbling system together, that kleptocracy. And yet it is a moment of extraordinary danger for Russia and therefore also for Armenia.
Let's draw another parallel with today's situation and the situation of 100 years ago. And a century ago, there was the demise of the Russian Empire. Then there was the creation and establishment of the Soviet Union, which started to muster, to collect its former territories and coming back to the Caucasus. Is this anyhow relevant to today's situation? Is it anyhow thinkable that Russia can come back to this region after the war in Ukraine?
That's a really good question. Let's think for a minute about what kind of war this is in Ukraine. Many pundits and government analysts were very confused when Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th of this year. It was not predicted. There was American intelligence that Putin was about to do this, but even President Zelensky of Ukraine was doubtful that there would be such an invasion because it didn't make sense. It was irrational. So everyone has been trying to figure out, myself included, and many of my colleagues, why did Putin do this? And the speculation of why Putin did this has ranged from he's completely delusional, maybe he's insane, he's completely isolated, COVID has affected his brain, he's ill, this is Russian nationalism run amok, Russia has now become a fascist state, Putin is a kind of Hitler, this is a colonial imperial war. And you can take your choices because all of these are speculative and it's very hard to determine what's happening. Now, what do we know about the war and what Russia has done? We know that initially Russia was very confident, for perfectly good reasons, that it could launch a war, quickly decapitate the Ukrainian state, perhaps capture or drive Zelensky out of the country. The Americans already had plans to rescue Zelensky and take over Kiev, put in a puppet government, and have a kind of satellite state a la a Soviet republic or Poland during the Cold War or something like that. All of that failed. We know that that Russian plan, as exaggerated and as ambitious as it was, simply failed in the mud, in the Rasputitsa of the Ukrainian steppe, right? They couldn't make that work. Secondly, Putin pulled back and tried to just hold on to Donbass and what they call Novorossiya, right? The crescent of state, of territory from roughly Kharkiv in the north to Kherson in the south. And that's where the war is now. But Putin lately has escalated both the rhetoric and the ambitions as he has conceived it. That is, this Novorossiya is now in the process of being annexed, physically annexed, in a way that Putin didn't annex Abkhazia and South Ossetia or Transnistria into Russia itself. So we have what you can call neo-imperialism, a territorial land grab, which is, of course, a complete violation of international law and the usual practices of states since roughly 1945, with some few exceptions, right? And what does that portend for Armenia and the South Caucasus? For the short term, it doesn't do much good. That is, Russia can hold on to what it has in Georgia and its presence, very weak presence in the South Caucasus, in Karabakh and near Armenia, but it can't act very forcefully, and the Azerbaijanis know this. But it could mean that once the war in Ukraine is settled, the world will turn upside down again. And Russia does have serious interests in the South Caucasus. Its most faithful ally for the last 30 years has been, of course, Armenia. And though it has in some ways betrayed that ally and misused that ally, I'm sad to say that, nevertheless, Armenia has remained, because it has no other strategic choices, basically dependent, you could say loyal to Russia. So the future may be more bright for Armenia in that Russia eventually, as a great power that sees itself as the great mediator, as the one that can settle these conflicts on its borders, Russia will, I believe, at some point return. But we have to wait, because the war in Ukraine is now a war of attrition. It's a protracted war. and it's going to go on through the winter into the early part of next year at least. So Armenians need patience, they need unity, they need strength to hold on until their erstwhile, undependable, unreliable ally Russia returns to the South Caucasus.
Professor Suny, let's talk a bit about Russian-Turkish relations. Again, drawing some parallels with the past. 100 years ago, the Bolsheviks were collaborating with Turkey, Russia's arch rival or Russia's rival in the First World War. Now Russia is having this sort of so-called compartmentalized relations with Turkey. In one compartment, they are geopolitical rivals, and in other compartments, they are good economic partners. They are doing very good trade and lots of other things. And Turkey is factually the only NATO country that didn't join the anti-Russian Western sanctions. What kind of impact this relationship can have on Armenia and on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue particularly?
I would say that the effect of this Turkish-Russian relationship is ambivalent for Armenia. It can go either way. Think about what's going on. You have two autocratic figures, two strongmen, Erdogan and Putin. And both of them are acting in their own state's narrow interests. And those interests both coincide in some ways and conflict in some ways. Turkey is obviously the major ally of Azerbaijan. It supplied the Bayraktar drones, which did such damage, along with Israeli drones in the war in Karabakh. So on one side, Erdogan and Putin stand opposed to each other in Armenia and in a number of other issues. On the other hand, Erdogan is playing a very shrewd game. He has placed himself, along with Macron of France and maybe the other post-Soviet figures, it's hard to say at the moment, as a kind of mediator, as someone that can talk both to Kiev and to Moscow. And he's elevated his role. By the way, Turkey is doing very badly economically. There's a huge crisis. I have in-laws now, it turns out, in Turkey. My younger daughter married a Turkish citizen. My granddaughter, just newly born, is in fact the heir of this marriage. And I'm in contact with people, and they're all suffering. They're suffering, and there's tremendous discontent in Turkey. But Erdogan is incredibly shrewd. He's playing an international role as a grand mediator, and therefore has this prestige. And by the way, he's even managed to convince Joe Biden, the president of the United States, who personally does not like Erdogan, that you have to play footsie with me. You have to understand what power I have. And the United States, in its own strategic and opportunistic way, has decided, well, there are very distasteful figures like Erdogan or like the leader of Saudi Arabia. We have no choice. We have to, in kind of crass, cynical, strategic ways, deal with these people. So the relationship is very ambiguous. And for Armenia, it both presents real dangers, but also opportunities. Because ultimately, if Russia can reassert itself in the South Caucasus, if it can in fact flex its considerable muscles back in that area after it settles what dangers it faces in Ukraine, then it will be in a position to push a little bit against Erdogan and Azerbaijan, and perhaps come to the aid more forcefully to its only ally in the region, namely Armenia. But I'm speculating here, as we do in such interviews and such punditry, and am trying to imagine a future. And here, history doesn't give us a lot of ammunition to make accurate predictions about this near future?
So it's really very, very difficult to make any prediction, not just accurate prediction, and there are so many black swans around. So, and given all these unpredictabilities, what would be your advice about the relations of Armenia and Russia? Of course, we understand that Armenia has been always threatened by its neighbors, and it's going to be probably perpetually threatened by its neighbors. What kind of relationships we should develop with Russia, no matter who rules Russia, given all our dependencies on that country?
Karen, you know better than I do the despair and pessimism, the sense of hopelessness that Armenians might feel at the moment. But let me try to give you a more positive picture from distance, from here, from Ann Arbor, Michigan. First of all, Armenia has real strengths. It is a really democratic, disorganizedly democratic country. And that is what you can call soft power. It's not accidental that Nancy Pelosi, one of the most powerful people in this country, made the effort to go to Armenia with all the visibility that she brings to that journey, right? So imagine she showed, I'm going to go to Taiwan. I'm going to stand for Taiwanese democracy against a hegemonic power, China. I'm going to Armenia, little Armenia that people don't pay attention to, and I'm bringing all of my prestige, all of my visibility to that little place. And that's extraordinarily important. That had a great effect in America. Okay, maybe temporarily, maybe one or two news cycles, as they say, but it was on the front pages of the New York Times, of the Washington Post, and other major outlets. It was on every newscast that evening. That's very, very important. So Armenia has soft power. It is a democratic state. Secondly, I've always been impressed in my visits to Armenia in the last 30 years, the power of Armenian civil society, the way in which Armenia, despite being ruled at one point by kind of mafioso oligarchs and so forth, in fact managed to maintain free debate, organizations, a public sphere, and eventually a popular movement that created a democratic state. So these are powerful things that Armenians can bank on, and that's extraordinarily important. It's very interesting. It's often said that Putin cannot stand democratic states, that he can't abide them. And one reason he invaded Ukraine was to destroy Ukrainian democracy. Well, this isn't quite true. Putin can live with democratic states. It lives with Finland for the last 30 years, the last century, in fact, if there's no threat from that democracy to the way the oligarchs and the establishment in Russia conceive of their interests. And I think President Pashinyan Premier Pashinyan has been very careful about not antagonizing Russia and Putin, and walking a very delicate path from not quite supporting the war in Ukraine, but not quite turning his back on Russia as well. So one of the things Armenia has to do in this delicate situation is maintain as much as possible, as difficult it is, that delicate relationship with Russia. In other words, unity and patience is what is most important at the moment.
And my last question, you're speaking about soft power, but what Armenia critically needs is hard power. How can we turn this soft power into a hard one so that we can overcome the immediate challenges we're facing now?
That's really an internal question and problem for the government and the society in Armenia. It's a very difficult problem. Soft power can be very effective, And that's the best weapon that the Armenians have at the moment. But of course, it has to be supplemented as much as possible by resistance, by organization of military forces, by sacrifices, which is very sad for someone so far away to say about this little nation, which is so vulnerable at the moment. But don't despair. Realize the strength that Armenians have, that they have had. This is an extraordinarily resilient nation. That's what I've learned from its history. The history of Armenians has always been one where it's confronted since the time of Tigran, Metz and Tigran, by great empires on either side of it. And yet somehow this little nation has managed to maneuver and play off one side against the other to take advantages of whatever little advantages it might find and to survive. And that resilience, that persistence, that survivability is what makes this nation. And I'm not saying we're a great power. How could we be a great power? But we are a very effective power, and I'm always optimistic. I mean, I'm an old guy, but I try to be always optimistic because, in fact, pessimism, despair will get you nowhere.
Okay, and let's finish on this optimistic note. Professor Suny, thank you very much.
Շնորհակալ եմ։
Շնորհակալություն։